of the first Maccabees. We're going to be reading in chapter 6 through chapter 10. The last days of Anticus, Epiphanes. Chapter 6. King Anticus, meanwhile, was making his way through the upper provinces. He had heard that in Persia there was a city called Elymaeus, renowned for its riches, its silver and gold, and its very wealthy temple containing golden armor, breastplates, and weapons, left there by Alexander, son of Philip, the king of Macedon, the first to reign over the Greeks. He therefore went and attempted to take the city and pillage it, but without success, the citizens having been forewarned. They resisted him by force of arms. He was routed and began retreating very gloomily towards Babylon. But while he was still in Persia, news reached him that the armies which had invaded Judea had been routed, and that Lysias in particular had advanced in massive strength, only to be forced to turn and flee before the Jews, that the latter were now stronger than ever, thanks to the arms, supplies, and abundant spoils acquired from the armies that had cut to pieces, and that they had pulled down the abomination which he had erected on the altar in Jerusalem, had encircled the sanctuary with high walls as in the past, and had fortified Beth-zur, one of his cities. When the king heard this news, he was amazed and profoundly shaken. He threw himself on his bed and fell sick with grief, since things had not turned out for him as he had planned. And there he remained for many days, subject to deep and recurrent fits of melancholy, until he realized that he was dying. Then summoning all his friends, he said to them, "Sleep evades my eyes, and my heart is cowed by anxiety. I have been wondering how I could have come to such a pitch of distress, so great a flood as that which now engulfs me. I, who was so generous and well loved in my heyday. But now I recall how wrongly I acted in Jerusalem, when I seized all the vessels of silver and gold there and ordered the extermination of the inhabitants of Judah for no reason at all. This, I am convinced, is why these misfortunes have overtaken me, and why I am dying of melancholy in a foreign land." He summoned Philip, one of his friends, and made him regent of the whole kingdom. He entrusted him with his diadem, his robe, and his signet, on the understanding that he was to educate his son Anticus and train him for the throne. King Anticus then died in the year 149. Lysias, learning that the king was dead, established on the throne the succession of him, his son Anticus, whom he brought up from childhood, and styled him Eupator. The people in the citadel at the time were blockading Israel round the sanctuary and were taking every opportunity to harm them and to support the Gentiles. Judas decided that they must be destroyed, and he mobilized the whole people to besiege them. They assembled and laid siege to the citadel in the year 150, building batteries and siege engines. But some of the besieged broke through the blockade, and to these a number of renegades from Israel attached themselves. They made their way to the king and said, "How much longer are you going to wait before you see justice done and avenge our fellows? We were content to serve your father, to comply with his orders, and to obey his edicts. As a result, our own people will have nothing to do with us. What is more, they have killed all those of us they could catch, and looted our family property. Nor is it on us alone that their blows have fallen, but on all your territories. At this moment they are laying siege to the citadel of Jerusalem to capture it, and they have fortified the sanctuary and Beth-zur. Unless you forestall them at once, they will go on to even bigger things, and then you will never be able to control them." The king was furious when he had heard this, and summoned all his friends, the generals of his forces, and the marshals of horse. He recruited mercenaries from other kingdoms and the Mediterranean islands. His forces numbered 100,000 foot soldiers, 20,000 cavalry, and 32 elephants with experience of battle conditions. They advanced through Idumea and besieged Bethzur, pressing the attack for days on end. They also constructed siege engines for the defenders, made a sortie, and set these on fire, putting up a brave resistance. At this, Judas left the citadel and pitched camp at Beth Zachariah, opposite the royal encampment. The king rose at daybreak and marched his army at top speed down the road to Beth Zachariah, where his forces took up their battle formations and sounded the trumpets. The elephants were given a syrup of grapes and mulberries to prepare them for the battle. These animals were distributed among the phalanxes, to each elephant being allocated 1,000 men dressed in coats of mail with bronze helmets on their heads. 500 picked horsemen were also assigned to each beast. The horsemen anticipated every move their elephant made. Wherever it went, they went with it, never quitting it. On each elephant, to protect it, was a stout wooden tower kept in position by girths, each with its 3 combinations as well as its mahout. The remainder of the cavalry was stationed on one or other of the 2 flanks of the army to harass the enemy and to cover the phalanxes. When the sun glinted on the bronze and golden shields, the mountains caught the glint and gleamed like fiery torches. One part of the royal army was deployed on the upper slopes of the mountain, and the other in the valley below. They advanced in solid, well-disciplined formation. Everyone trembled at the noise made by this vast multitude, the thunder of the troops on the march, and the clanking of their armor, for it was an immense and mighty army. Judas and his army advanced to give battle, and 600 of the king's army were killed. Eleazar called Avaran, noticing that one of the elephants was royally caparisoned, and was also taller than all the others, and supposing that the king was mounted on it, sacrificed himself to save his people and win an imperishable name, boldly charging towards the creature through the thick of the phalanx, dealing death to right and left, so that the enemy scattered on either side at his onslaught. He darted in under the elephant, thrusted it from underneath, and killed it. The beast collapsed on top of him, and he died on the spot. The Jews, however, realizing how strong the king was and how ferocious his army, retreated ahead of them. The royal army moved up to encounter them outside Jerusalem, and the king began to blockade Judea and Mount Zion. He granted peace terms to the people of Bethzur, who evacuated the town. It lacked store of provisions to withstand a siege, since the land was enjoying a sabbatical year. Having occupied Bethzur, the king stationed a garrison there to hold it. He besieged the sanctuary for a long time, erecting batteries and siege engines, flamethrowers, and ballistas, scorpions to discharge arrows, and catapults. The defenders countered these by constructing their own engines and were thus able to prolong their resistance. But they had no food in their stores, since it was the 7th year, and because those who had taken refuge in Judea from the Gentiles had eaten up the last of their reserves. Only a few men were left in the holy place, owing to the severity of the famine. The rest had dispersed and gone home. Meanwhile, Philip, whom King Anticus, before his death, had appointed to train his son Anticus for the throne, had returned from Persia and Media with the forces that had accompanied the king, and was planning to seize control of affairs. On hearing this, Lysias at once decided to leave, and said to the king, "The generals of the army and the men, we are growing weaker every day. We are short of food, and the place we are besieging is well fortified. Moreover, the affairs of the kingdom demand our attention. Let us offer the hand of friendship to these men and make peace with them and with their whole nation. Let us grant them permission to follow their own customs as before, since it is our abolition of these customs that has provoked them into acting like this. The king and his commanders approved this argument, and he offered the Jews peace terms, which they accepted. The king and the generals ratified the treaty by oath and besieged accordingly left the fortress. The king then entered Mount Zion, but on seeing how impregnable the place was, he broke the oath he had sworn and gave orders for the encircling wall to be demolished. He then hurriedly withdrew, making off for Antioch, where he found Philip already master of the city. Anticus gave battle and captured the city by force of arms. Chapter 7. Demetrius becomes king and sends Maccabees and Anticus to Judea. In the year 151, Demetrius, son of Seleucus, left Rome and arrived with a few men at a town on the coast, where he inaugurated his reign. It so happened that as he was entering the royal residence of his ancestors, the army captured Anticus and Lysias and intended to bring them to him. On hearing this, he said, "Keep them out of my sight." The army put them to death, and Demetrius ascended his throne. Next, all those Israelites without law or piety, or pity, led by Anticus, whose abomination was to become high priest, approached the king and denounced our people to him. "Judas and his brothers," they said, "have killed all your friends, and he has driven us out of our country. Send someone now whom you can trust. Let him go and see the wholesale ruin Judas has brought on us and on the king's dominions, and let him punish the wretches and all who assist him." The king chose Maccabees, one of the friends of the king, governor of Transfurities, an important personage in the kingdom and loyal to the king. He sent him with the godless Anticus, whom he confirmed in the high priesthood, with orders to exact retribution from the Israelites. So they set out with a large force, and on reaching Judea, sent emissaries to Judas and his brothers with proposals, peaceable yet treacherous. The latter, however, did not put any faith in their words. Aware that they had come with a large force, nevertheless, a commission of scribes presented themselves before Anticus and Maccabees to sue for just terms. The first among the Israelites to ask them for peace terms were the Hasidians, who reasoned thus: "This is a priest of Aaron's line, who has come with the armed forces. He will not wrong us." He did, in fact, discuss peace terms with them and gave them his oath: "We shall not attempt to injure you or your friends." They believed him, but he arrested 60 of them and put them to death in one day, fulfilling the words of Scripture: "They have scattered the bodies of your faithful and shed their blood all around Jerusalem, leaving no one to bury them." At this, fear and dread gripped the whole people. "There is no truth or virtue in them," they said. "They have broken their agreement and their sworn oath." Maccabees then left Jerusalem and encamped at Bethzeth, and from there sent and arrested many of the men who had deserted him, and a few of our people too. He had them killed and thrown down the great well. He then put Anticus in charge of the province, leaving an army with him to support him. Maccabees himself returned to the king. Anticus continued to struggle to become high priest, and all who were disturbing the peace of their own people rallied to him, and having won control of Judea, did much harm in Israel. Seeing that all the wrongs done to the Israelites by Anticus and his supporters exceeded what the Gentiles had done, Judas went right round the whole territory of Judea to take vengeance on those who had deserted him and to prevent their free movement about the country. When Alchemist saw how strong Judas and his supporters had grown and realized that he was powerless to resist them, he went back to the king, to whom he had made malicious accusations against them. The king sent Nicanor, one of his generals, ranking as illustrious and a bitter enemy of Israel, with orders to exterminate the people. Reaching Jerusalem with a large force, Nicanor sent a friendly yet treacherous message to Judas and his brothers as follows: "Let us have no fighting between you and me. I shall come with a small escort for a peaceful meeting with you." He met Judas, and they exchanged friendly greetings. The enemy, however, had made preparations to abduct Judas. When Judas became aware of Nicanor's treacherous purpose in coming to see him, he took fright and refused any further meeting. Nicanor then realized that his plan had been discovered and took the field against Judas to give battle near Kafar Salamah. About 500 of Nicanor's men fell. The rest took refuge in the city of David. After these events, Nicanor went up to Mount Zion. Some of the priests came out of the holy place with some elders to give him a friendly welcome and show him the burnt offerings being presented for the king. But he ridiculed them, laughed at them, defiled them, and used insolent language, swearing in his rage, "Unless Judas is handed over to me, this time with his army, as soon as I am safely back, I promise you, I shall burn this building down." Then he went off in a fury. At this, the priest went in again and stood weeping in front of the altar in the temple, saying, "You have chosen this house to be called by your name, to be a house of prayer and petition for your people. Take vengeance on this man and on his army, and let them fall by the sword. Remember their blasphemies, and give them no respite." Nicanor left Jerusalem and encamped at Beth-horon, where he was joined by an army from Syria. Judas, meanwhile, camped at Edessa with 3,000 men, and offered this prayer: "When the king's envoys blasphemed, your angel went out and struck down 185,000 of his men. In the same way, let us see you crush this army today, so that everyone else may know that this man has spoken blasphemously against your sanctuary. Pass judgment on him as his wickedness deserves." The armies met in battle on the 13th of the month Adar, and Nicanor's army was crushed, he himself being the first to fall in the battle. When Nicanor's soldiers saw him fall, they threw down their arms and fled. The Jews pursued them a day's journey from Edessa to the approaches of Gazar. They sounded their trumpets in warnings as they followed them, and people came out of all the surrounding Judean villages to encircle the fugitives, who then turned back on their own men. All fell by the sword, not one being left alive. Having collected the spoils and booty, they cut off Nicanor's head and the right hand he had stretched out in a display of insolence. These were taken and displayed within sight of Jerusalem. The people were overjoyed and kept that day as a great holiday. Indeed, they decided to celebrate it annually on the 13th of Adar. For a short while, Judea enjoyed peace. Chapter 8 of the first book of Maccabees. Now Judas had heard of the reputation of the Romans, how strong they were and how well disposed toward any who made common cause with them, making a treaty of friendship with anyone who approached them. And indeed, they were extremely powerful. He had been told of their wars and of their prowess among the Gauls, whom they had conquered and put under tribute. and of all they had done in the province of Spain to gain possession of the silver and gold mines there, making themselves masters of the whole country by their determination and perseverance, despite its great distance from their own, of the kings who came from the ends of the earth to attack them, only to be crushed by them and overwhelmed with disaster, and of others who paid them annual tribute, Philip, Perseus, king of the Kittim, and others who had dared to make war on them had been defeated and reduced to subjection, while Anticus the Great, king of Asia, who had advanced to attack them with 120 elephants, cavalry, chariots, and a very large army, had also suffered defeat at their hands. They had taken him alive and imposed on him and his successors, on agreed terms, the payment of an enormous tribute, the surrender of hostages, and the cession of the Indian territory with Media, Lydia, and some of their best provinces, which they took from him and gave to King Eumenes. Judas had also heard how, when the Greeks planned an expedition to destroy the Romans, the latter had got wind of it, and sending a single general against them, had fought a campaign in which they inflicted heavy casualties, carried their women and children away into captivity, pillaged their goods, subdued their country, tore down their fortresses, and reduced them to a slavery lasting to the present day, and how they had destroyed and subjugated all the other kingdoms and islands that resisted them. But where their friends and those who relied on them were concerned, they had always stood by their friendships. They had subdued kings far and near, and all who heard their name went in terror of them. One man, if they determined to help him and advance him to a throne, would certainly occupy it, while another, if they so determined, would find himself deposed. Their influence was paramount. In spite of all this, no single one of them had assumed a crown or put on the purple for his own aggrandizement. They had set up a senate where 320 counselors deliberated daily, constantly debating how best to regulate public affairs. They entrusted their government to one man for a year at a time, with absolute power over their whole empire. And this man was obeyed by all without envy or jealousy, having chosen Eupolemus, son of John, of the family of Anticus, and Jason, son of Eleazar. Judas sent them to Rome to make a treaty of friendship and alliance with these people, in the hope of being rid of the yoke, for they could see that Greek rule was reducing Israel to slavery. The envoys made the lengthy journey to Rome and presented themselves before the Senate with their formal proposal. Judas Maccabees and his brothers, with the Jewish people, have sent us to you to conclude a treaty of alliance and peace with you, and to enroll ourselves as your allies and friends. The proposal met with the approval of the senators. Here is a copy of the rescript, which they engraved on bronze tablets and sent to Jerusalem to be kept there by the Jews as a record of peace and alliance. Good fortune attend the Romans and the Jewish nation by sea and land forever. May sword or enemy be far from them. If war comes, first to Rome or any of her allies throughout her dominions, the Jewish nation will take action as her ally, as occasion may require, and do it wholeheartedly. They will not give or supply to the enemy any grains, arms, money, or ships. Thus has Rome decided, and they are to honor their obligations without guarantees. In the same way, if war comes first to the Jewish nation, the Romans will support them energetically, as occasion may offer, and the aggressor will not be furnished with grain, arms, money, or ships. Such is the Roman decision, and they will honor these obligations without treachery. Such are the articles under which the Romans have concluded their treaty with the Jewish people. If later either party should decide to make any addition or deletion, they will be free to do so, and any such addition or deletion will be binding. As regards the wrongs done to them by King Demetrius, we have written to him in these terms: Why have you made your yoke lie heavy on our friends and allies, the Jews? If they appeal against you again, we shall uphold their rights and make war on you by sea and land. Chapter 9. Demetrius, hearing that Nicanor and his army had fallen in battle, sent Bacchades and Alcimus a second time into Judea, and with them the right wing of his army. They took the road to Galilee and besieged Mesaloth in Arbela and captured it, putting many people to death. In the first month of the year 152, they encamped outside Jerusalem. Then they moved on, making their way to Bir Zeth with 20,000 foot and 2,000 horse. Judas lay in camp at Elasa with 3,000 picked men. When they saw the huge size of the enemy forces, they were terrified, and many slipped out of the camp until no more than 800 of the forces were left. With battle now inevitable, Judas realized that his army had melted away. He was aghast, for he had no time to rally them. Yet, dismayed as he was, he said to those who were left, Up, let us face the enemy. We may yet have the strength to fight them. His men tried to dissuade him, declaring, We have no strength for anything but to escape with our lives this time. Then we can come back with our brothers to fight them, but by ourselves we are too few. Judas retorted, That I should do such a thing as run away from them. If our time is come, at least let us die like men for our countrymen, and leave nothing to tarnish our reputation. The army marched out of the camp and drew up facing the enemy. The cavalry was drawn up in 2 squadrons. The slingers and archers marched in the van of the army, and all the best fighters were put in the front rank. Bacchides was on the right wing. The phalanx advanced from between the 2 squadrons, sounding the trumpets. The men on Judas's side also blew their trumpets, and the earth shook with the noise of the armies. The engagement lasted from morning until evening. Judas saw that Bacchides and the main strength of his army lay on the right. All the stout-hearted rallied to him, and they crushed the right wing, pursuing them as far as the Azara hills. But when the Syrians on the left wing saw that the right had been broken, they turned and followed hot on the heels of Judas and his men to take them in the rear. The fight became desperate, and there were many casualties on both sides. Judas himself fell, and the remnant fled. Jonathan and Simon took up their brother Judas and buried him in his ancestral tomb at Modian. All Israel wept and mourned him deeply, and for many days they repeated this dirge. What a downfall for the strong man, the man who kept Israel safe. The other deeds of Judas, the battles he fought, the exploits he performed, and all his titles to greatness have not been recorded, but they were very many. After the death of Judas, the renegades came out of hiding throughout Israel, and all the evildoers reappeared. At that time, there was a severe famine, and the country went over to their side. Maccabees deliberately chose the enemies of religion to administer the country. These traced and searched out the friends of Judas and brought them before Maccabees, who ill-treated and mocked them. A terrible oppression began in Israel. There had been nothing like it since the disappearance of prophecy among them. The friends of Judas then all united in saying to Jonathan, "Since your brother Judas died, there has been no one like him to head the resistance against our enemies. People like Maccabees and others who hate our nation. Accordingly, we have today chosen you to take his place as our ruler and leader and to fight our campaigns." Whereupon Jonathan took command in succession to his brother Judas. Maccabees, when he heard the news, made plans to kill Jonathan. But this became known to Jonathan, his brother Simon, and all his supporters, and they took refuge in the desert of Tekoa, camping by the water supply at Asphar storage well. Maccabees came to know of this on the Sabbath day, and he too crossed the Jordan with his entire army. Jonathan sent his brother, who was one of his commanders, to ask his friends, the Nabateans, to store their considerable baggage for them. The sons of Amariah, however, those of Madaba, intercepted them, captured John and everything he had, and made off with their prize. Later, Jonathan and his brother Simon were told that the sons of Amariah were celebrating an important wedding and were escorting the bride, a daughter of one of the great notables of Canaan, from Nabada with a large retinue. Remembering the bloody end of their brother John, they went up and hid under cover of the mountain. And as they were keeping watch, a noisy procession came into sight with a great deal of baggage, and the bridegroom, with his groomsmen and his family, came out to meet it with tambourines and a band and rich, warlike display. The Jews rushed down on them from their ambush and killed them, inflicting heavy casualties. Their survivors escaped to the mountain, leaving their entire baggage train to be captured. Thus the wedding was turned into mourning, and the music of their band into lamentation. Having in this way avenged in full the blood of their brother, they returned to the marshes of the Jordan. As soon as Maccabees heard this, he came on the Sabbath day with a considerable force to the steep banks of the Jordan. Jonathan said to his men, "Up, let us fight for our lives, for today it is not as in the old ways or old days. You can see, we shall have to fight on our front and to our rear. We have the waters of the Jordan on one side and the marsh and the scrub on the other, and we have no line of withdrawal. This is the moment to call on heaven to deliver you from the clutches of your enemies." The engagement was begun by Jonathan, who aimed a blow at Maccabees, but the Syrian disengaged himself and withdrew, whereupon Jonathan and his men leapt into the Jordan and swam to the other bank. The enemy did not, however, cross the Jordan in pursuit. That day, Maccabees lost about 1,000 men. Maccabees went back to Jerusalem and began fortifying some of the Judean towns, the fortresses of Jericho, Emmaus, Beth-horon, Bethel, Timnath, Pharathon, and Tephon, with high walls and barred gates, and stationed a garrison in each of them to harass Israel. He also fortified the town of Beth-zur, Gezer, and the citadel, and placed troops in them with supplies of provisions. He took the sons of the leading men of the country as hostages, and he had them placed under guard in the citadel of Jerusalem. In the year 153, in the second month, Anticus ordered the demolition of the wall of the inner court of the sanctuary, destroying the work of the prophets. Anticus had just begun the demolition when he suffered a stroke, and his work was interrupted. His mouth became obstructed, and his paralysis made him incapable of speaking at all or giving directions to his household. It was not long before he died in great agony. On the death of Anticus, Maccabees went back to the king, and Judea was left in peace for 2 years. The renegades then all agreed on a plan. Now is the time, they said, while Jonathan and his supporters are living in peace and are full of confidence, for us to bring back Maccabees, and he will arrest the lot of them in one night. So they went to him and reached an understanding. Maccabees at once set out with a large force, and sent secret instructions to all his allies in Judea to seize Jonathan and his supporters. But they were unable to do this because their plan became known, and Jonathan and his men arrested some 50 of the men of the country who were ringleaders in the plot, and put them to death. Jonathan and Simon then retired with their partisans to Beth-Bassi in the desert. They rebuilt the ruinous parts of the place and fortified it. When Maccabees heard this, he mustered his whole force and notified his adherents in Judea. He then proceeded to lay siege to Beth-Bassi. The fighting was protracted, and he constructed siege engines. Jonathan, however, leaving his brother Simon in the town, broke out into the countryside with a handful of men. He launched a blow at Odemira and his brothers, and at the sons of Phasaron in their encampment, whereupon these two came into the struggle, joining forces with him. Simon and his people meanwhile made a sortie from the town and set fire to the siege engines. Taking the offensive against Maccabees, they defeated him. He was greatly disconcerted to find that his plan and his assault had come to nothing, and vented his anger on those renegades who had induced him to enter the country, putting many of them to death. He then decided to take his own troops home. Discovering this, Jonathan sent envoys to negotiate peace terms and the release of prisoners with him. Maccabees agreed to this, accepting his proposals and swearing never to seek occasion to harm him for the rest of his life. Having surrendered to Jonathan those prisoners he had earlier taken in Judea, he turned about and withdrew to his own country, and never again came near their frontiers. The sword no longer hung over Israel, and Jonathan settled in Michmash, where he began to judge the people and to rid Israel of the godless. Chapter 10. In the year 160, Alexander, son of Anticus Epiphanes, raised an army and occupied Ptolemais. He was well received, and there inaugurated his reign. On hearing this, King Demetrius assembled a very large army and marched off to do battle with him. Demetrius furthermore sent Jonathan a most conciliatory letter, promising to promote him in rank. For as he said, we had better move first to come to terms with these people before he makes common cause with Alexander against us. He will not have forgotten all the wrongs we inflicted on him and his brothers, and on his nation. He even authorized him to raise an army, to manufacture arms, and to describe himself and his ally, and ordered the hostages in the citadel to be surrendered to him. Jonathan went straight to Jerusalem and read the letter in the hearing of the whole people and of the men in the citadel. They were terrified when they heard that the king had given him authority to raise an army. The men in the citadel surrendered the hostages to Jonathan, who handed them back to their parents. Jonathan then took up residence in Jerusalem and began rebuilding and restoration of the city. He ordered those responsible for the work to build the walls and the defenses round Mount Zion of squared stones, blocks to make them stronger, and this was done. The foreigners in the fortresses built by Maccabees abandoned them, one after another, leaving his post to go back to his own country. Only at Bethsur were a few left of those who had forsaken the law and the precepts, since this was their refuge. King Alexander heard of all the promises Demetrius had sent to Jonathan, and he was also given an account of the battles and exploits of this man and his brothers, and of the hardships they had endured. "Shall we ever find another man like him?" he exclaimed. "We must make him our friend and ally." He therefore wrote him a letter addressing him in these terms: "King Alexander, to his brother Jonathan, greetings. You have been brought to our notice as a strong man of action, and as someone who deserves to be our friend. Accordingly, we have today appointed you high priest of your nation, with the title of friend of the king." He also sent him a purple robe and a golden crown. "And you are to study our interest and maintain friendly relationships or relations with us." Jonathan put on the sacred vestments in the 7th month of the year 160. On the Feast of Shelters, he then set about raising troops and manufacturing arms in quantity. Demetrius was displeased when he heard what had happened. "What have we been doing," he said, "for Alexander to forestall us in winning the friendship of the Jews, and so improving his own position? I too shall address an appeal to them, offering them advancement and riches as an inducement to support me." And he wrote to them as follows: "King Demetrius, to the Jewish nation, greetings. We have heard how you have kept your agreement with us and have maintained friendly relations with us and have not gone over to our enemies, and it has given us great satisfaction. If you now continue to keep faith with us, we shall make you a handsome return for what you do on our behalf. We shall accord you many exemptions and grant you privileges. Henceforth, I release you and exempt all the Jews from the tribute, the salt dues, and the crown levies. And whereas I am entitled to 1/3 of the grain and 1/2 of the fruit of the trees, I release from this levy. From today and for the future, Judea and the 3 districts annexed to it, from Samaria, Galilee. From this day henceforth in perpetuity, Jerusalem will be sacred and exempt, with its territory from tithes and dues. I relinquish control of the citadel in Jerusalem and make it over to the high priest, so that he may man it with a garrison of his own choosing. Every Jewish person taken from Judea into captivity in any part of my kingdom I set free without ransom, and decree that all will be exempt from taxes, even on their livestock. All festivals, Sabbaths, new moons, and days of special observance, and the 3 days before and 3 days after a festival, will be days of exemption and quittance for all the Jews in my kingdom, and no one will have the right to exact payment from or to molest any of them for any matter whatsoever. Jews will be enrolled in the king's forces to the number of 30,000 men and receive maintenance on the same scale as the rest of the king's forces. Some of them will be stationed in the king's major fortresses, and from among others appointments will be made to positions of trust in the kingdom. Their officers and commanders will be appointed from their own number and will live under their own laws, as the king has prescribed for Judea. As regards the 3 districts annexed to Judea from the province of Samaria, these will be integrated into Judea and considered as coming under one governor, obeying the high priest authority and no other. Ptolemais and the land thereto pertaining, I present to the sanctuary in Jerusalem to meet the necessary expenses of public worship. And I make a personal grant of 15,000 silver shekels annually, chargeable to the royal revenue from appropriate places. And the entire surplus, which has not been paid in by the officials as in previous years, will henceforth be paid over by them for work on the temple. In addition, the sum of 5,000 silver shekels levied annually on the profits of the sanctuary, as shown in the annual accounts, is also relinquished as the perquisite of the priest who perform the liturgy. Anyone who takes refuge in the temple in Jerusalem or any of its precincts, when in debt to the royal exchequer or otherwise, will be discharged in full possession of all the goods he owns in my kingdom. As regards the building and restoration of the sanctuary, the expense of the work will be met from royal exchequer. The reconstruction of the walls of Jerusalem and the fortification of the perimeter will also be a charge on the royal exchequer. I have no idea how to say this. Exchequer. As also the reconstruction of other city walls in Judea. When Jonathan and the people heard these proposals, they put no faith in them and refused to accept them, remembering what great wrongs Demetrius had done to Israel and how cruelly he had oppressed them. They decided in favor of Alexander, since he seemed to offer the better inducements of the two, and they became his constant allies. King Alexander now mustered large forces and advanced against Demetrius. The two kings met in battle. Alexander's army was routed, and Demetrius pursued him and defeated his troops. He continued the battle with vigor until sunset. Demetrius himself, however, was killed the same day. Alexander's marriage with Cleopatra. Jonathan as commander-in-chief and governor-general. Alexander sent ambassadors to Ptolemy, king of Egypt, with this message: Since I have returned to my kingdom, have ascended the throne of my ancestors, have gained control by crushing Demetrius, and so recovered our country. For I fought him, and we crushed both him and his army, and now occupy his royal throne. Let us now make a treaty of friendship. Give me your daughter in marriage. As your son-in-law, I shall give you and her presents which are worthy of you. King Ptolemy replied as follows: Happy the day when you return to the land of your ancestors and ascended their royal throne. I shall at once do for you what your letter proposes, but meet me at Ptolemais, so that we can see one another, and I shall become your father-in-law as you have asked. Ptolemy left Egypt with his daughter Cleopatra and reached Ptolemais in the year 162. King Alexander went to meet him, and Ptolemy gave him the hand of his daughter Cleopatra and celebrated her wedding in Ptolemais with great magnificence, as kings do. King Alexander then wrote to Jonathan to come to meet him. Jonathan made his way in state to Ptolemais and met the two kings. He gave them and their friends silver and gold and many gifts, and made a favorable impression on them. A number of scoundrels and the pest of Israel combined to denounce him, but the king paid no attention to them. In fact, the king commanded that Jonathan should be divested of his own garments and clothed in the purple, which was done. And the king then seated him by his side and said to his officers, Escort him into the center of the city, and proclaim that no one is to bring charges against him on any count. No one is to molest him for any reason. And so when his accusers saw the honor done him by this proclamation, and Jonathan himself invested in the purple, they all fled. The king did him the honor of enrolling him among the first friends, and appointed him commander-in-chief and governor-general Jonathan then returned to Jerusalem in peace and gladness. In the year 165, Demetrius, son of Demetrius, came from Crete to the land of his ancestors. When King Alexander heard of it, he was plunged into gloom and retired to Antioch. Demetrius confirmed Apollonius as governor of Coal, Syria. The latter assembled a large force, encamped at Jamnia, and sent the following message to Jonathan the high priest. You are entirely alone in rising against us, and now I find myself ridiculed and reproached on your account. Why do you use your authority to our disadvantage in the mountains? If you are so confident in your forces, come down now to meet us on the plain, and let us take each other's measure there. On my side I have the strength of the towns. Ask and learn who I am, and who the others supporting us are. You will hear that you cannot stand up to us, since your ancestors were twice routed on their own ground. Nor will you now be able to withstand the cavalry or so great an army on the plain, where there is neither rock nor stone nor refuge of any kind. On hearing Apollonius' words, Jonathan's spirit was roused. He picked 10,000 men and left Jerusalem, and his brother Simon joined him with reinforcements. He drew up his forces outside Joppa, the citizens having shut him out, since Apollonius had a garrison in Joppa. When they began the attack, the citizens took fright and opened the gates, and Jonathan occupied Joppa. Hearing this, Apollonius marshaled 3,000 cavalry and a large army and made his way to Azotus, as though intending to march through, while in fact pressing on into the plain. Since he had a great number of cavalry on which he was relying, Jonathan pursued him as far as Azotus, where the armies joined battle. Now Apollonius had left 1,000 horsemen in concealment behind them. Jonathan knew of this enemy position behind him. The horsemen surrounded his army, firing their arrows into his men from morning till evening. Excuse me. But the troops stood firm, as Jonathan had ordered. Once the cavalry was exhausted, Simon sent his own troops into attack against the phalanx, which he cut to pieces and routed. The cavalry scattered over the plain and fled to Azotus, where they took sanctuary in Beth Dagon, the temple of their idol. Jonathan, however, set fire to Azotus and the surrounding towns, plundered them, and burned down the temple of Dagon, with all the fugitives who had crowded into it. The enemy loses, counting those who fell. The enemy losses, counting those who fell by the sword and those burnt to death, totaled about 8,000 men. Jonathan then left and pitched camp outside Ascalon, where the citizens came out to meet him with great ceremony. Jonathan then returned to Jerusalem with his followers, laden with booty. In the event when King Alexander heard what had happened, he awarded Jonathan further honors. He sent him the golden brooch, of the kind of customarily presented to the king's cousins, and gave him proprietary rights over Ekron and the land adjoining it. I want to thank everybody for joining me today for the reading of chapter 6 through 10, and we will be back again to resume reading chapters 11 through 15.